Since the start of shelter in place and really the intensity of the crisis ramping up on the church side, we were putting out fires left and right. We were just trying to figure out how to translate the life of our church into, like everyone else, into a fully online and digital space. And it was chaotic. It was a lot of good work, but it was a lot of, just a flurry of activity. And so when I saw the statement come through, I realized, wow, I have not actually taken time for myself to understand and process and work through everything that all of this is bringing up as an Asian American woman in ministry in particular. And so I was super thankful. I could see like the thoughtfulness of, and prayer that went into the crafting of the statement, like being really honest and truthful about the reality of what's happening to Asians and Asian Americans, as just different forms of more blatant racism are rising up across the country, and just the care, just pastoral level of care and concern that went into that. I could see that, and just the idea of mobilizing people, not just Asian Americans, but those who are standing in solidarity with the effort and the cause. It made me realize, like, wow, this is speaking to everything I value and care about. But in the midst of this crisis, I hadn't really, again, given myself time and space. So I really needed it. I'm super grateful to you, Ray, and for everyone who contributed to that. It's really amazing the timeliness of what you were able to do, bringing it forward so quickly, mobilizing people so quickly. I feel like at that time, we were just swamped in the media, just with the scary statistics, what was happening in the hotspot areas. Like there wasn't really the kind of pastoral care and the just the raising up of the fact that this is a highly dangerous and racial, just the issue of race is so real to so many of us, but we're not able to fully process it. So I appreciated the timeliness of it, and the opportunity to use it as a resource for our church. Because we had so much going on, it was really, truly a gift to be able to share that with our church and to kind of invite other people into the conversation.
Yeah. Wait, so before I turn to Daniel, it sounds like you might have had similar experiences or like what resonated with you on a personal level with the statement?
Again, it really is the honesty of naming race, the fact that racism is real for Asian Americans in this country. And at least for me personally, that took me a long time to recognize. And it was actually like so much gratitude to InterVarsity, the Chicago Urban Project. That's really the immersive experience of being in an environment that's not my own, the west side of Chicago. I grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago, which is a totally different world. But being able to see firsthand kind of what systemic racism actually is, and to fully experience that and become more aware of it, that was the starting point for me to actually recognize that racism is real. I personally have been affected by it, even though I wasn't willing or able to name it for myself. And this goes so far beyond me. Like, this is the world we live in that's highly racialized. And so for myself, it's been so many years now of just this ongoing process of learning and understanding who I am in the midst of this racialized system that's kind of built on this foundation of white supremacy. And it's taken lots of people, lots of conversations to learn that and to see it. So, just the conciseness of what was brought forward in the statement. For me, it represented like a years-long journey of understanding the system of race and understanding that Asian Americans are not exempt by any stretch. And I think what we're seeing now is not necessarily anything new. It's always been there, but the circumstances and the situation that we're in right now is kind of catalyzing a new manifestation of it that feels maybe more intense and painful. But again, that foundation of the evil of white supremacy has always been there.
Can I ask one more? So it seems like you had a journey of kind of like a racial awakening, and you were talking about how you grew to see it, or you came to a point where you started understanding it. And I think there's a lot of Asian Americans that don't really understand how race works. What was it for you that helped you to start seeing it?
Yeah. Again, for me, it was just God's gift of this catalytic experience. I was a freshman in college. It was spring break. I was staying for a week in yeah, on site in the Austin community, a community that's been just ravaged by poverty and racism and all the systemic effects of that. So being able to interact with real people who have lived the just the devastating effects of racism and to be taught it as well. Like I was so blessed to be with teachers who helped coach me through it. But again, that opened a door. Like once I saw that and was willing to acknowledge and recognize the truth that racism is a thing that's very real. It's in the air we breathe. From that point forward, it's been a process of intentionally putting myself in situations where I might not feel the most comfortable and people might not look like me, but I know that God is present and there and wanting to teach me more of who he is. So just overcoming just the social awkwardness and all the things that happen when you're kind of putting yourself out there. That's probably been like over stages with like church environments I place myself in, social environments, work environments even. Having worked at Wandale Christian Health Center was a big kind of, for me, that was a big milestone, kind of thinking back to being in the Austin community with InterVarsity, and then being able to intersect my sense of passion and call in the healthcare field with a sense of ministry and dismantling racism. So that was, again, there was a big learning curve. It wasn't comfortable by any means, but learned a lot and so fortunate. And then of course, being a part of River City Community Church that that my husband and I have been a part of for almost 15 years now. It's been a really nurturing and eye-opening environment. We're challenged in a lot of ways by the experiences of others, and it's uncomfortable and hard, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's been amazing.
No, that's so helpful. There's so much we could just continue to mine there, and hopefully we can encourage you to contribute to our site, the Asian American Christian Collaborative.com, and write some articles about your own journey and other things that you've been seeing. But Daniel, I'd love to hear from you as well. Like when you read it, what resonated with you? You were quick to sign on to it, and I know that Christine was the one that beat me to the punch to getting it to you. But I'd love to hear kind of your process through it and what your thoughts on the statement were.
Well, I was, like Christine said, I thought it was very thoughtfully put together. I think that's something we've come to appreciate in a multicultural context, is that words matter a lot. How you talk about things matter a lot, not only to be accurate theologically, which is of course always critical, but just to take into account the nuances of the way that race divides us. It probably takes 5 times longer to say the same thing when you're trying to do it in a way that includes lots of different people. So we were appreciative of that right away. I think some of the foundational values for us at our church that feel like they come up quickly in times like this. One would be the 1 Corinthians 12 idea that when one part of the body suffers, we should suffer with it, or the Romans equivalent of that when Paul says, I think also Romans 12, when he says, when we should celebrate with those who celebrate, mourn with those who mourn, right? So I think, I guess if I'm honest, it feels like the American church in particular is not very good at that. Like we kind of live in our own silos and tend to be disconnected from the experience of others. So I want to be better at that. When a part of the body is suffering, I want to be quick to move into a position of understanding and listening on that and joining in within that. And so I was thankful that a group of you had taken the time to really put to word some of what was happening and invited others into that. And so that's just something that just felt instinctive and easy to do, to say yes, even if it's not our own personal experience yet, and if it's not something I fully understand, we should absolutely listen and be quick to move towards that. And then just, I think for our church, a big, we believe that the kind of 2 Corinthians 5, when Apostle Paul says that we've been sent out with the ministry of reconciliation, that we're ambassadors of reconciliation. I think that's a very far-reaching term, but we've got kind of a pretty deep conviction in our church that the system of race is one of the most kind of grotesque, evil principalities and strongholds that stands in the way of God's purposes. And whenever that manifests itself on a broad level, I think it's important for the church to kind of become aware of that and to look for ways to participate with Jesus Christ in that. So those are all reasons that made it really easy to quickly jump on with their statement.
Thanks both of you for sharing kind of your reactions and your responses to what we wrote. One of the things that you were sharing is how it really it's the proximity to those from different people groups, different ethnic groups, different racial groups that really drove and help you deepen your understanding and your empathy of the realities that they face. You're both leading a multi-ethnic, multicultural church in the Humboldt Park area of Chicago, and I'd be curious, one, why did you go that route? Especially because it's a lot harder to do than to follow the homogeneous unit principle, which I believe is very counter to the kingdom of God, and that's probably one of the reasons that you chose to go that route. But two, because it is, we do operate in a society of convenience where, it's far easier to just do ministry with people that look like us, kind of are like us. Why choose the difficult route of that? And then also, what are some of the things that you've learned as a result of doing ministry in that way, in terms of like how the body actually functions together? Because the average church in America is at least 4 times more segregated than the neighborhoods that they're in. And I think that's an indictment on the Christian faith, that Jesus is the gospel of Jesus is able to bring together people who would normally separate, turn enemies into friends, as C.S. Lewis would say. But our churches seem to be going the opposite direction overall, and yet your church is making intentional decisions to live into a community that's multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial. And I would be curious as to why you chose to live into and press into that, why others should consider that as something that they should pursue if they're church pastors or leaders, or even if they're just lay persons within the church. And then what have some of the challenges been, and what are some of the blessings been?
There's a lot of ways to go with that. I guess I would even start with just the most Jesus boils it down to the great commandment, right? That everything can be summed up by love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, love your neighbor as yourself, right? So if we even just start there, to me, even before going deep theology, you can just start at the logical level, that if those are the 2 most important mandates, if you ask the question, which is more effective for experiencing those in a robust way, to do it in a homogenous setting or to do it in a diverse setting, in my mind, there's no question the qualitative difference in those experiences. Right? Well, I grew up in homogenous settings all my life, and people tend to have the similar conversations, similar blind spots, strengths for sure, but nobody can really call out the collective weaknesses because there's not the presence of those who can even see those weaknesses and those blind spots. And so it's almost selfish for me. I came to a conclusion that if I really wanted to see God and understand God in a profound and robust way, it was a real threat for me to stay in culturally homogenous environments, for just a whole lot of reasons. I think you can develop that in a bunch of different ways theologically, but that's just the bottom line. And then I think to carry out the mandates that God's given us to bear witness to Christ through word and deed, I just, again, think there's just immense limitations on us when we only know how to move within the space of our own culture. And I just don't think you can really understand what everybody else is facing and how to participate with the life of Jesus Christ in the world when your inputs, your sources of formation and shaping are bound by one particular culture group. So I don't want to be judgmental. I think there are times, immigrant havens, other kind of things where it does make sense to be in culturally homogenous settings. But I would say just even at the starting point for me, I would no longer understand how to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, love my neighbor myself, outside of being in a diverse setting where that's a shared priority.
I would just echo what Danielle already shared. There is a sense of, I think, limitation. I almost think of it, for me, it was like experiencing church in like 2D, and then seeing that there's so much more, and like transitioning over to 3-dimensional. Like once you see what's kind of the richness of who God is and how he works through his people, it's not just differences in worship style, it's like everything, how, again, like our theology, our perspectives, our lived experiences, going from a culturally homogenous perspective just felt, it felt important and meaningful. And I should say this, for me, the Korean American church was extremely vital and important to my own spiritual development and growth. I would not trade that for anything. It was needed in certain areas of my walk and my growth. And as I kind of learned and grew, once you kind of see the depth of who God is and what his community can look like, yeah, it's hard to want anything different, and it's worth the extra work and the very real challenges that are presented by it.
So what are some of the things that, if people are interested in pursuing uh, what I believe is the call of God for the church to be a picture of God's kingdom where every tribe, nation, tongue can gather, if that's possible, um, what are some of the things that they need to anticipate, kind of moving in that direction, that they'll need to address, and then what are some of the things that they'll have to that they can also, I guess, anticipate in both the sense of like, this is going to be a cost that you're going to have to pay, and this is also going to be a blessing that you're going to see as a result.
We did a series last year at our church that was pretty landmark for us, only in the sense we've often done series on the theology of race and how to move towards multiculturalism. But it feels like as we've gotten older, we've gotten more kind of mature in our language to how to talk about it. And so it was a really important series. We called it Life in Multicultural Community. But we said it's hard to understand how to live in multi-community without looking at kind of both you have to look from two different angles. So we kind of just spoke to the first. So we said the first angle is to see what the richness of diversity can do for you in terms of seeing God better, seeing yourselves better, seeing God's mission in the world. And I really do believe that's real, that there's benefits to kind of expanding your sight and your faith and your understanding of God. But we said, but at the same time, there is this very real thing of race that's unique to the kind of time we live in, right? I mean, it's not the same thing that was exactly around in the biblical times, right? The system of race we're in is a little bit different. The way it's built around whiteness and white supremacy. And so we said at the end of the day, and this is work we do a lot at our church, that to understand race, you have to understand the lie behind race. And the lie behind race is that human value is tied to proximity to whiteness. Themes we can get back to if you want to, but you can't enjoy the benefits of diversity without at the same time combating the lies that sustain race. And so we use that as a framework because that's helpful, because there's challenges and opportunities on both sides of that, right? On the diversity side, I mean, right, there's all kinds of stuff written just about the cultural competence that's needed to be in a multicultural space and how to function with each other. Just diversity alone is complex. But talking about the lie behind racism is not exactly the same thing as talking about diversity. And that can feel threatening to people in different ways, right? So if you're white, it can feel threatening because you feel like you're being attacked because you're white. Depending on what your different ethnic background is and where you're at kind of on the racial hierarchy, it can be threatening in different kinds of ways. It can be vulnerable, it can be risky. But I think I'm a pretty big believer in that I think you have to have both conversations where you're talking about the dynamics of diversity and how that works and the cultural competence required to do that, but also to be able to talk about, to develop a theological lens for the system of race and how to understand it as a principality and stronghold and how to understand the lies that sustain it. Yeah, I mean, I certainly can go back to this has been my own journey, right? Like when people would talk about race when I was in my 20s, when I was white, and I was white then, I was white early on, been white for a long time. Yeah. But when people would talk about stuff like that, it was very confusing. It felt threatening a little bit. I had been conditioned to think of it as a conversation that's outside of the Bible, it's outside of the gospel, kind of this, in my head, if I'm just being honest, my upbringing, kind of this liberal agenda that so it took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around what it is. And I think especially for those of us who are white and have never had to think about what race is, I do think it takes a little bit of work to kind of get to understand this. But yeah, what we really focus on is that there is this system of race. I think the word race is something that should be used very differently than ethnicity or culture. I think ethnicity and culture are reflections of God's created order. They can be sinful, but they can also be redeemed because they're from God and they reflect God. Race, I think, is a term that's used to describe this very real system that was created to create a sense of hierarchy, to create a sense of consolidated power. And it's doesn't affect everybody equally. It was, of course, we weren't called white when we came to the United States. All the different European groups were known by the places they came from, right? It was British and Irish and German and Polish and Italians. But in order to be able to kind of move forward with the objective to take over the land, dispossess the land from Native people, and to move forward the objective of kidnapping and bringing African people to become slaves here, we needed this kind of racial system that consolidated all European groups into a category called white, consolidate all the Native groups into this singular racial category, consolidate all African people into kind of black. Then, of course, building out Latino and Latina and Asian American over the course of it. So that system and the lies that required to kind of organize around that does feel like it's a pretty paramount thing to understand if you're going to understand kind of why racism is such a threat to Jesus and his kingdom.
Christine, I'd love for you to respond to that too. Like you're Asian American, right? we were talking about racism. You also mentioned something about white supremacy. Why do you talk about whiteness, right? Why is it important for you to talk about whiteness?
Yeah, I think to build on kind of the two different categories that Daniel mentioned, with diversity being a beautiful thing, and I've kind of reflected this already in what I've shared, like how we can see God more clearly. There's just a gift of being in diverse community. You can't really do that, at least not in our racialized society, without actively naming and addressing, confronting and dismantling the reality that white supremacy is real, and it's what drives the system of race. And for me, this has been more a recent part of my own racial journey and understanding myself. As part of the Life and Multicultural Community series that Daniel mentioned, I did a lot of my own soul searching and understanding of the ways the lie of white supremacy has affected me as an Asian American woman. And that was hard. It was hard work to do, to look back on a lot of my life choices, what I've aspired towards, and how I've had a sense of value from my achievements and success. And this is very much a part of the immigrant ethos, right? This was seen as the investment of my parents. The hard work of those who came before me was to achieve and see success in white America. And in order to do that, I had to move closer and closer and closer as much as I could towards whiteness, through appearance, through success and achievement, what I can prove. It was, growing up, it's through grades, it's what schools you get into, it's what jobs you can secure afterwards. Realizing that there is this very hard tension of the sacrifice of of the generations that came before us, and the reality that in order to succeed in this country requires almost whole-scale adoption. That word assimilation really took on a different meaning to me as I realized that actually meant just moving closer to whiteness. And that does not come at that's not a neutral thing. So as an Asian American, to move towards whiteness is to perpetuate a system that further oppresses Black and Brown communities. And that's just a lot of tension to sit in between. It was almost like the values of my family and my culture are being pitted against who I believe in the resurrected Jesus, and and my belief that the entire system of race is evil and not of God. So yeah, that was very much a journey for me to name that for myself, that as an Asian American, I am not exempt from white supremacy. And if anything, it's more of it's a concrete choice. Once I see it, now that I kind of see it more for what it is, now I realize I have a choice to move towards white supremacy or to move towards dismantling white supremacy. There's no such thing as, I think, neutrality in this situation.
That's really good, and that's really helpful. Daniel, you wrote a book called Wide Awake, and I appreciated how you shared that. You wrote it in part because you just realized that when people kept coming to your church, when new people came in, you were having to have the same conversations over and over and over again. And so you just said, hey, this is kind of where we are. We need to address whiteness. And as you've done that, I'd be curious, either from either of you, how that has shaped the direction of the church, and in what ways that's actually helped you be more faithful to the calling of God upon the church in its local expression. And then we'll ask a few other questions after that. But I'd love to hear kind of how that's kind of played out in the life of your church.
Well, I do think one of the balancing acts you have to do in this work is you don't ever want to kind of create these overgeneralizations, right? That to be white equals X, or to be Asian American equals X, for sure. At the same time, I think when you're pastoring people, I do think cultural identity development is really important. I think one of our bedrock, I'm sure you have, this is a consistently Christian one, like one of our bedrocks is that our identity should be most formed by who we are in Christ, right? That should be our long-term formation work. We often use language of the baptism of Jesus when the voice of God says, "You are my son, you are my beloved, I take delight in you," right? We often say, like, that's the goal. That's where we're all trying to move towards, is to have our identity most deeply formed in that. But the system of race is so powerful, and the lies behind race are so powerful, that it's constantly competing with that sense of identity. And so to even understand who you are as a child of God, you've got to be able to separate out the lies that race is told. And that's true for everybody, not just white people. But we've had to kind of recognize in our church that there's kind of a uniquely challenging piece for white people, and that our society doesn't require or insist or in any way even provoke white people to think about cultural identity very often. And so there has to be kind of a longer runway for those of us who are white to start doing the work to understand what the system of race is, why that's contrary to the kingdom of God, how we can get increasingly free of that, how we can then participate in the reconciliation work that Jesus is doing in this day and age. And so again, that work is important for everybody, but White Awake has been kind of helpful for us to create curriculum specific to the white Christian experience, and to help them not only understand what race is, because it's actually not that hard to see what race is. The bigger problem is that it provokes all these defense mechanisms, right? People get very outraged, they feel very defensive, they feel very attacked, or they sometimes go the opposite direction, feel incredibly ashamed and kind of collapse under that, super disoriented, start to question everything in Christianity because of some of these things. So there's just I don't know how to think about discipleship without helping people understand the system of race that we're all formed in. Again, that's applicable to everybody, but that was some of the purpose of White Awake, is to create curriculum specific to kind of the white Christian experience.
Christine, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts, especially as a racial minority. I'd be curious, like in some ways, it sounds like by addressing it, we're also recentering whiteness, by saying, okay, this is what we have to talk about. But at the same time, we're just addressing reality, right? And so we don't want people to feel shamed. We don't want people to feel burdened by this terrible guilt that they really didn't have a choice in choosing their own life or their own melanin content. But at the same time, it's something that all of us have inherited. Right, we've been birthed into a racialized society, and some of us have the ability to neglect and to ignore the consequences of that. Especially the negative effects of that, while others of us have to live with it almost every single day. One of the things I've been saying regularly is, for me, I've on a visceral level started understanding what it's like to be Black for a short season, because my appearance is just a threat to the whole society. And this is what Black people have basically experienced for all of their lives, or for most of their lives, on a broad scale. And some people have been spared because of their kind of upbringing, or the ways in which their parents have insulated and protected them, or the way that their churches have come around them. But I'd be curious, why do you, we talked about it a little earlier, but why should Asian Americans in particular press into this? And what have been some of the effects of this, as you've seen at the local level in your church, in your multicultural church?
Yeah, it's such a multi-layered question, and addressing a very complex reality, I think, for Asian Americans in this country. Asian Americans, yes, in this country. I feel like there has to be, for me, there's needed to be a very clear sense of intentionality to want to understand what whiteness is and how white supremacy has affected me, and to desire to, something, I think Daniel mentioned this before, like one of our values as a church in building authentic community is mourning with those who mourn, suffering with those who suffer, also celebrating with those who celebrate as well, but that intentionality to step into the real lived experiences of others who are facing situations that are different from my own. It doesn't happen by accident. And honestly, it doesn't even happen just by being a part of a beautiful mosaic of diversity in our church. Like, there has to be even more intentionality of, for me, I found I've only been able to receive the benefits of, or the kind of the beauty of being in multicultural community when I've been forced to be vulnerable myself and open myself up. And again, the intentionality is so important, because any given day, if I'm honest, as an Asian American woman who comes from a social location that I come from, I can actually choose to be pretty much almost white. in my profession, in kind of the marketplace, as I move through the city of Chicago, as I, just go out and live my day-to-day life, there are a lot of, I experience this daily. There's a temptation to just be like, no, I'm just going to choose to be white today and like not have to address the reality of the system of race. But ultimately, that's where this is like so deeply spiritual and very much a faith-driven thing for me, is that I cannot love my neighbor if I choose to take that route of comfort and privilege that is made available to me, but leads me in a very different direction than if I choose to tackle head on the reality that white supremacy is real. It affects the Black community in deeply intense and different ways than it does the Asian American community. But as an Asian American, there is still, it's just this tough place of like being stuck in that tension of, it's not easy either way. It's not easy to pursue whiteness. It's not easy to recognize the reality of white supremacy. So then, because there is no like clear choice of comfort, it's really is, what do I value most? What do I believe most? And use that to guide my my behaviors and what I intentionally focus on.
Well, that's so good. There's so much we could just even unpack in that. Daniel, you're writing a new book. I'd be curious what your thoughts are, or if you'd be willing to share some kind of insights from what you're currently gathering, and then I'd love to kind of hear from both of you a charge on how, one, we can care for Asian Americans in this time, and then two, if you have ways that you're doing that within your church, but then two, how especially as Asian Americans, we can stand in solidarity with other ethnic and racial groups as injustices continue to rise. Especially because at the local church level, I think is where there can be kind of the most kind of dynamic, on the ground, earthy. We can wrap our hands around some practical ways forward. And I'd love to hear the things that you guys have been learning for the past 15 to 20 years in doing ministry together. But before we go into that, Daniel, could you share a little bit about the book that you're writing, what we should be anticipating, and then some of the insights that you're gleaning from it?
Yeah, sure. I can go quick on that part. Yeah, so it's called White Lies. It will be coming out in September with Zondervan. And a lot of it comes out of, since White Awake came out, I've been doing a lot of work, particularly in Christian colleges. As you know, we've done some stuff together at Wheaton. And so I've enjoyed working with the next generation as they're kind of confronting and combating the system of race. But one of the things that's discouraging, not so much with the students, but what they've inherited, and I've seen this everywhere I've gone, is that even the white students who care, and more broadly than this, but I'm particularly talking about white students formed in evangelical settings right now, when they're in their faith system that they're from, when they express to their pastors or families or spiritual leaders that they're wanting to wrestle with this stuff and understand it better, understand how to be on the side of Jesus, they're consistently told that it's not a core priority of the Bible, that it's not a core discipleship function, that it's kind of outside the scope of what's kind of critical to Jesus and his work. And that's discouraging, that in the way we're taught discipleship, that confronting something like a stronghold of white supremacy just doesn't fit in how many of us have come to think of discipleship. And so as we started doing that work, I kind of came back to, I think, one of the most foundational paradigms for discipleship, for the way God works in the world, is truth and lies. That Jesus says he's the truth, right? I'm the way, the truth, and the life. John 10, when you know the truth will set you free. The devil is most clearly characterized as a liar. The devil works through lies, right? You can develop that all different ways theologically. But I think that's one of the most core discipleship functions, is to be able to, kind of in the spirit of Romans 12, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, up to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? The kind of purposes of God. And so I've come to a conviction that if somebody can't understand the system of race as a sophisticated set of lies protected by the devil, which I'd go so far to say, where it's perhaps the strongest principality and most powerful stronghold in our day and age, if you can't understand the way that, as Jesus calls the devil in John 8, the father of lies, the way that the devil kind of protects the lies behind the system of race, you're not going to see it very much as a spiritual thing. You're certainly not going to have the spiritual power then, right? Ephesians 6, the Apostle Paul says, beware of the devil's schemes, right? Before you put on the armor of God, you should actually beware of how the devil works. And so that's a lot of what White lies about. It's more overtly theological than Wide Awake was, in the sense that we've got to understand the lies behind the principality of white supremacy. Everybody does, but white people especially need to do the work to understand how even our own sense of course, we shouldn't be ashamed that we're white. God made us that way, but we should be very aware of the principality of whiteness and the way the devil uses that to create all different kinds of levels of harm. So that's kind of the rest of the next one.
Yeah, I mean, the system of the race is inherently dehumanizing, and so to address it
Totally.
Really forces us to press into the humanizing power of God, and in the incarnation we see that that's that the humanness of our reality is so essential to our being and our essence. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'll look forward to highlighting it and sending you some quotes that are my favorite. But yeah, I'd love to pivot into how we can move forward, right? So one of the benefits of having conversations with local church pastors is, especially pastors that are doing things on the ground and have been doing so for for over a decade, is that you've seen what works and what doesn't work. And in one sense, I'd love to hear, how has the church kind of mobilized? How's your church mobilized in caring for the Asian American community at this time, in light of the multicultural, multi-ethnic realities? And then also, how do you think we need to be standing in solidarity with one another? Because one of the questions that I always get from local church pastors is, I feel like you're having this conversation up here, but we need to know what to do down here. And so maybe you can help us with the down here piece, because you've been doing it for so long, as you're also having this conversation up here.
Daniel, do you want to take a pass at this first?
The white guy to talk about how to care for Asian Americans before you do? Sure. Well, the part I think can speak to is there are things that are not specific to the Asian American experience, but that are specific because that's what's happening right now. So I think, just to reiterate these again, I think with just the idea of who we are, identity, right? Who we are is such a fundamental piece of how we understand God, right? That's like all the language, like being born again or brought into sonship and daughtership through adoption into God, right? It's being calling God Father. This constant sense of knowing who we are is forgiven and beloved children, knowing who we are in Christ. That's just such an essential part of discipleship, of kind of functioning day to day, and it affects everything, right? Having a sense of who you are affects how you are in your workplace, how you are in your family environment. And so so we try to take that down one level even deeper and say, to know who you are, you have to not only rest in the truths of who God says you are, but you have to be conscientious to name the lies that say what you are, that are trying to disrupt your sense of being who you are in Christ. And I think there's a big, long biblical kind of trajectory of that. And so that's where, in times like this, when the lies around race become kind of exasperated in new kinds of ways and are attacking the identity of people, we have to come back to those never changing realities. Like, here's the truth that you must rest in, but also here's the lies. And it's hard to combat lies when you don't actually know what the lie is. So understanding like what the lies that are being told, right? All the way from renaming it the Chinese virus, all the way down, right? In the ways it's playing out, right? There's these lies, do you really belong, right? And so I think helping people rest in the truth of what God says, but also naming the lies and rejecting and combating those becomes a big piece. And that's inherently pastoral. That's one-on-one conversations, right? That's just creating space to talk through with people. But I really do, I think to be able to enter into the world with any sense of confidence and courage, you have to have an increasingly deepening knowledge of who you are in Christ. Again, I think it comes from inhaling deeply the truths, but I do think you have to understand the lies too. I think that part often is understated, that part of getting to the truth is separating the lies, and helping people separate the lies, I think, is a really big piece.
Sorry about the knocking. Either my 5-year-old or my 7-year-old is trying to bust in here right now. Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I think first because the Asian American Christian community is not monolithic. There's such a range in experiences, theological perspectives, how we see what race is and what it isn't. And so this is a really unique time. I feel like, it's world changing in every respect. But I feel like there is this immediacy, like a need to be responsive to the very real pain and suffering that is occurring within the Asian American community in particular. And there's this reality that what we're actually talking about and trying to address is something that's so much deeper and so foundational, that requires almost like an all-in investment of a willingness and a desire to really understand what race is and how it affects all of us. And so I guess my best hope is that we can listen and stand with those who are experiencing the very real dehumanizing effects of racism, specifically towards Asian Americans in this time and age, while also seeing this potentially for some of us as an entry point into a deeper level of discipleship and growth and understanding of who God is and how he manifests in the world. And also giving ourselves grace too. Like, this is not something we're going to understand and address in a short period of time. But can we first focus on our people who are experiencing real pain and real, this real sense, maybe some of us for the first time, of dehumanizing, whether it's microaggressions or physical verbal assault, everything that we're hearing about that's just so heart-wrenching and tragic. Like, can we see that and believe that there is something there that's real, that that's affecting our brothers and sisters in a very real way? See that as a first step, though, not an end-all be-all, as a first step into maybe more an ongoing journey of personal transformation and understanding what race is.
Yeah, I think the fact that people can so easily deny the existence of racism shows such a deep blindness and a lack of humility to even just hear out what other people are experiencing on a semi-regular basis. And so I'm grateful for that. As we wrap up, I'd be curious if there's anything else either of you would like to add that we weren't able to address or get to. I mean, our conversation went in a lot of different directions because there were just so many good things that you were saying that I wanted to keep pressing into. But is there anything that you would want to kind of leave as a charge or leave as a final kind of word of encouragement?
I think for me, it's again just balancing kind of the long-term foundational realities versus also the need to respond when they manifest in new ways. I'm like thinking that, have you ever heard that saying, like, when you're in crisis, you really need good friends, but you can't start making good friends in crisis. Like, you needed to develop the friendships way before the crisis came. So when the crisis came, you can lean into those. And so I do think there's a discipleship mandate for us that it is hard if you've not already come to understand how the system of race is a stronghold that stands in the way of the kingdom of Jesus and his work. It makes it doubly difficult to kind of process it when manifestations like this show up in society. And so I think it is a charge to continue to see that racism is not some secondary or obscure or social or whatever the term would be, reality, that it's a principal contender for the hearts and minds of people, and is one of the most active ways that evil is working in the world. And we just got to, as Christ followers particularly, we've just got to come to understand what that stronghold is, how it plays out. And as you understand them more, when manifestations like this happen, it's not actually surprising because evil is going to keep popping back out in different ways, right? And so I don't think that minimizes it all, that we should take serious the current manifestation of it and respond to that, to walk in solidarity. But it's part of a long play of kind of the presence of evil here. And I think we have to kind of hold that in balance as well.
There's just like so much to say. And also just like, I know we're looking for a concluding statement here, Ray, so I'll try the best I can. My best hope is that there are real connections that can be built within the Asian American Christian community in particular. And that's why I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing for this collaborative. I've never seen anything like it before. I don't know if anything like this has ever existed, but there is a need for it, and there's a need to see one another as Asian American brothers and sisters trying our best to follow Jesus in our context, in our day and age. And I feel like there's also so much here for us to all have grace with one another too, as we kind of get to know each other as a maybe more mobilized and organized community than we've ever been before. To see that race, the system of race, is so big. It affects affects me as an Asian American in very particular ways, and I can't limit my understanding of race just in the ways that it's affected me. And so I also have a lot of work to do to put myself in learning environments where I can understand and empathize and have true, authentic compassion for the ways that the system of race manifests differently across the board. Yeah, I'm just hopeful and prayerful that that there is good that can come from, at least there's good that can come from God's people coming together, being in community with one another, learning from one another, and seeking truth together. And so that's my best hope for us, seeking truth together.
That's a great way to end. I'm so thankful for both of you, Christine Chang and Daniel Hill, pastors at River City Church in the Chicago area. And Daniel, if for those who haven't read Wide Awake, it's a great resource for you to use in your churches, especially if you're diving into this conversation. And I'll be looking forward to your upcoming book, White Lies. Christine, I hope that you will consider contributing to the site, writing some articles and sharing more of your perspective, which has been extremely helpful and illuminating. Thank you both for taking this time with me.